Good evening.
Hey Martin, how you doing?
I am good.
Hi guys,
Hey
Hello.
Michael,
I saw you
long time no
typing.
see.
Uh, uh. Hi Jeff.
Hey, have y'all been since we last spoke? I think 4 of the 5 people in this call have been on Zooms several times throughout the day. Adding myself to the agenda now.
Hey, folks.
Hi.
Hey.
I'll wait another minute or two for anyone who's going to join slightly late. We might actually have everybody who's in our attendee list, which is surprisingly tight this meeting. Totally fine. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Listed in the 1, 2. I think we got everybody. Rob, did I see you add yourself to the attendee list, but not see it? I've just been blindly merging pull requests and not double checking that they're going to the right file or anything like that.
Thought I did it. Maybe I put in the wrong file. Let me double check.
Oh, no, you totally did it in the right file, and I screwed up a merge request or a merge. I added Jeff's and it looks like it overwrote yours, which is weird. I don't think it showed me a conflict, which is strange.
I'll open another PR.
Chalk. Cool.
You
I
use
appreciate it.
if you use refined GitHub, which is a really nice browser extension, they've got a nice little just approve both where it removes all the merges and effectively just puts both people in. That's what I use all the time for
Oh,
doing this stuff. It's real nice.
that's a nice tool. Sorry I missed everybody last month's meeting. I was in jury duty, which didn't actually end up yielding anything interesting in the first place. I like got as far as going through the whole selection process, and on the very last day got disqualified, and so got sent home. So I got to like burn half of a week doing that without actually like getting to see the case itself, which felt like the worst of both worlds. Like if you're gonna use my time, at least leave me with interesting stories. But I was lamenting that it like happened to overlap over our meeting, so sorry for having missed that, but excited to be here today. We actually have a pretty decently beefy agenda considering that our attendee list is tight. So let's jump into it. Okay. The official kickoff, we all agree to the membership agreement, participation and contribution guidelines and code of conduct. Links there anytime anyone wants a refresher. For the benefit of anyone catching up on this on Zoom later, and now as I'm saying that, let me like triple check. Yes, recording is in fact going. Let's just do a quick round of intros. We'll read down the list as referenced in the markdown file. So hello everybody, my name is Lee, and I'll be leading the meeting today.
Hello everyone, my name is Martin. I work at Apollo and happy to be here.
Hi everyone, Benji from GraphQL.
Hey everyone, Michael from Chili Cream.
Hey everybody, Jeff from Apollo.
Hey guys, Rob from Perstives.
Excellent, thank you everyone. Okay, just to do a quick overview of our agenda to make sure that we've got everything that we want to talk about. We're going to talk about ID serialization as string. It looks like that's a bit of a note and a recap. Talk about strict error paths, some definition of selection sets, ordering of schema elements, and request extensions. Anything else that we would want to talk about today that's not already listed out on our agenda? Cool. If each of these ends up being shortish conversations, I imagine we can have some pickup topics at the end, if anything pops up. But otherwise, let's jump into things. In terms of review, I actually don't believe we had anything waterfall over into the other agendas. I'm going to pull those up just to confirm that that's the case. But yes, okay. Yeah, no overflow agenda to review. Let me pull open action items just in case. I would suspect that we probably don't have anything. Correct, we do not have anything. All right, cool. We just get right to the fun stuff. Benji, I'll hand it to you to talk us through ID string serialization.
Yeah, okay. So we had some wording in the spec that was basically that ID should always serialize as string. That feels like it should have been a must. In fact, reading the rest of the spec text, there are many places where we state that it is a string. So I raised this as an RFC 0 of, I think this should have been a must, but said, I think really it's an editorial. And it seems Quay agreed with me and went ahead and merged it. So this is more of an indication that we have merged this. And if there's any resistance to doing so, let's get that raised. Because it did kind of bypass the RFC process. That said, I do think it's editorial.
Sweet.
So it's more,
I'm glad that
more on input it can be an int, but on output it's always a string, right?
Ooh, it's a good call.
that's right.
Because on input you have these polymorphic IDs where it could be encoded or it's an int which is database ID or whatever.
Well, this only relates to the serialization. So whatever the answer to that question is, it doesn't affect the specific pull request.
Yeah, there's in the ID section of the type system chapter, there's the bit on input coercion. Input coercion will accept string literals, numeric literals, or variables of ID, which will then, of course, coerce any kind of input you put into the JSON. Because numeric IDs are quite common. And so allowing people to drop the quotes around the numeric literal is a convenience. But happy to see this one get very quickly merged. This is in fact a good editorial change. I suspect that there's probably, I would not be surprised if we find other places through the spec where we were not appropriately specific in our language when we use the words should and must. There's probably a number of places where we say should or should always. And if I'm putting on my pedantic code reviewer hat, you could replace the entirety of the phrase should always with the word must, as opposed to just the should there. You know, it says it should always serialize as a string, could have just been it must serialize as a string. We left it as it must always serialize as a string, which means exactly the same thing. So I'm not gonna go. We actually change it, but good editorial change, Benji. Good editorial change.
On to Martin.
Yeah, perfect CU. Actually, I
Martin.
think it's the same kind of issue. We have this error pass, and today in the spec it says it should be a list of pass segments with strings or indexes, and the proposal is to change that into a must, which is pretty important for all the strict nullability stuff and nullability if we want to be able to parse errors correctly.
Great.
So we've been discussing that for a couple of months now, and I think there was a global consensus around the proposal. And if I remember correctly, I think this was the last step, and we were to merge that this month or something like so.
I'm
Yeah,
gonna do
it
it
has-
live. I think
has
this
broad
is good to
agreement.
go. Yeah, I remember this from February where since this was slightly more than a one-word change and we were nervous that anyone might have not relied on this or used that as an opportunity to go digging and see if they had any bugs in that particular area. But I'm glad to see a handful of people chimed in on the thread to say that it looks great. So I will, let's see, swap out the label. Boom, boom. Merged.
Yay.
Perfect. Great catch, Martin. We need to close the relevant action items as well. Those are 1482 and 1499. I'm just going to go ahead and do that myself now.
Go for it.
Change from should to must, close, and 1482. Check that it won't break your implementations for error paths. Yeah, I believe that's the same one. Close. Those are both closed.
Sweet. All right. I hope everybody was able to catch those and fix any issues, but I suspect that it'd be pretty rare that we find any issues. So thanks again for helping us catch that one. Okay. Definitions of selection sets. Benji.
Okay, this is another editorial pull request. We have discussed it a few times at the working group now, just been honing the wording. Broadly, this relates to an issue raised where one of the examples in the documentation was talking about the serial execution of selection sets and gave an example of a selection set, which caused confusion because shouldn't that be a mutation operation? It's a selection set within the mutation operation. So what I have done broadly is I have made it so that one of these examples is in fact a mutation operation. Initially, I made it a mutation operation and that was it, but Kuei pointed out that it didn't have any variables. So now it is a mutation operation that defines the variables that it uses, and the wording above it now says, given the following mutation operation, the root selection set must be executed serially. rather than just saying, given the following selection set, it to be executed serially. The other example that does the same thing refers to a selection set executing serially. I've just put a GraphQL comment at the top to explicitly state again that this is a selection set. Note, this is a selection set, not a full document using the query shorthand. This is a selection set. So hopefully that makes that a bit clearer. In addition to that, I realized that we don't seem to actually have a definition of what a selection set is. So I've added one and then cross-referenced it in many places. My definition is very short. A selection set defines an ordered set of selections, fields, fragment spreads, and inline fragments against an object, union, or interface type. And that's it. And then the rest of it is mostly me adding underscores.
Just, I think that's really helpful. I don't know, like sometimes like end users of GraphQL, particularly on the beginner intermediate side, they could just always use a much more clearer understanding of the semantics. And selection set is one of those concepts where, you know, a lot of folks kind of get it by osmosis. So +1 to making it really clear. I think that could help a lot of folks who are just on the beginning of their GraphQL journey. And honestly, folks who need a refresher, maybe who are starting to work on it after an absence of a while.
I find the one example that you have there with the differs interesting. In the description of the PR. Do we allow to spawn the like? I mean, this is not related to this one, but to when we introduce defer, right? Then you could
Going a
kind
little
of-
off topic there, Michael, but yes.
Sorry.
That
It's
is an
it's your
open
example.
discussion in the incremental delivery working group as to what defer means when we combine it with mutations. But my broad point with this pull request is serial execution of a selection set is separate to handling of mutations. It's just that at the moment, the only place where you have serial execution of a selection set is for a mutation, but that may not always be the case. It might not be the case in 10 years' time when we've added a bunch of extra features. So I wanted to kind of be a bit more distinct.
This seems great. I noticed you mentioned for mutations, you fixed it to have a direct reference to the selection set. The other places you didn't use the underscores. Was that intentional or is that oversight?
Sorry, I didn't quite follow.
I'm just like scanning through as like a last editorial pass in the section 6 doc that got changed. I'm looking at the execute query, execute mutation.
Oh, I see your comment.
Execute. Yeah, there's just like a couple of those references. I wasn't sure if those were intentionally left non-referencing because you had referenced it earlier, or if those were oversights that you wanted to fix.
It's because they're algorithm steps. Do we normally do references in algorithm steps?
I don't remember, but I noticed. Oh, did you not? Okay, maybe I was misreading. I thought you had done it in one, but not the other.
I don't think so.
There are other places where we feel like I see let errors be the list of all field error, where field error is using the underscore reference.
I think because the top paragraph in mutation introduces the definition, I've then not bothered repeating it in the algorithm steps, and same for query.
Cool. Okay. That's aligns to our slightly unofficial style guide. I always find it hard to read when it's like every single reference is linked because it's like the entire text is all talking about terms of art and the entire text ends up being italicized and then linked, and it's like hard to keep track of things. So the like unofficial style guide being the first time within a section or sort of the first time within recent memory of using it, you relink it. And this seems to be correct there. I am noticing a general pattern. Benji, it always makes me excited anytime you like add more of the like double colon style references that we added before. It's like super cool to see that turning into dictionary term. But I'm noticing a bit of a pattern where before we had that, we were kind of like, okay, this is a case where we weren't linking it, but there's a bunch of cases where we either refer to a concept or even directly link to something that's defined in the grammar. So selection set was already well defined because we have the defined grammar where it's like it is a list. Here's grammatically how you express it. It's a list of fields and fragment spreads and inline fragments, which is the definition that you literally wrote out. But it's a grammatical term rather than like a generalized term. So I think this is probably the right editorial change to make. It gives us like a hard link somewhere that defines the general concept as opposed to just the grammatical rule. But I suspect there'll be other cases where we find this, and I wonder if we're okay with them being sort of like double defined in this way, to have like the general rule and then also have the grammatical form.
It's a good call out, and I think you're right. When we refer to those grammatical rules, we obviously do it in the Pascal case with the curly braces, which then cross references. I think it's generally good to have a glossary style definition rather than a technical grammar style definition. So I think it's okay. Maybe it would be wise in those situations to actually pull out the definition that is with the grammar and reference the glossary definition instead. So like move where the definition is when we talk about those concepts, perhaps.
Yeah. My thought was, if we decided that if we start doing this a lot, having double definitions of things ends up being less helpful than we want it to be. There may be a world where our canonicalized, because we canonicalize by lowercase, I think we just lowercase all the definitions. So if you define something with an uppercase character, it just gets flattened out so that if you have a reference at the beginning of a sentence, you can uppercase the word and it'll still correctly link. We could do that and parse out Pascal case style text to do the same thing. You know what I mean? Like we canonicalize it as like a sequence of words where spaces or Pascal or whatever doesn't impact that, such that the definition can all go to one place, and that will require us to then not double define things. You know what I mean? Like it either gets defined as a Pascal case thing or a sentence case thing, but either way, like you can only define it one time. You got to choose. Are you defining it with the grammar or are you defining it with a generalized concept? I don't know. It may be a thought for us to kind of like scan through the full compiled spec and see if this is starting to get confusing to read. Just a thought I had.
Well, not wanting to expand the conversation too much more, but one of the other issues is plurals. It's always a challenge to reference a plural, and that's a thing that keeps coming up in all the other specs that we're doing. As we're building whole new spec texts, we're having to be careful to word things in such a way that we try, when we link to a definition, to not use a plural. Having a solution to that would be ideal. I know that you've got in SpecMD, you've got the like config file or something somewhere where you can reference external places. Maybe having like aliases or equivalences or something like that in there, so you could add the singular and the plural might be a solution to that. Not a big major concern, but it is something that does keep cropping up.
Yeah. Or maybe just straight up using markdown link style formatting for the cases. That way we can be explicit to say, here's whatever text, which is plural, or because sometimes plurals are strange, right? Because the plural part is in a different part of the word, or English is hard. And we want to be like super clear about what the canonicalized thing it's linking to is. But that's a good point. Okay, food for thought. Mostly the reason why I wanted to frame that out is I want to make sure that we maintain the principle of the spec being as easy to read as possible, while also doing this very good work of making sure that we actually reference and fast link all these concepts, make it easier to navigate around the doc. That's all bonus thoughts. Cool. I think this is great. Glad to see a bunch of official stamps on it, and I'm going to merge it. Okay. Ordering schema elements up next.
This one is a nice one.
I've not gotten to pre-read this yet.
You commented on it,
Just
right?
bear with me a sec whilst I'm making sense of where we got to. So Lee, we have discussed this previously, but I think you've got a comment in here from you on January where you suggested adding an appendix. So I had a look at this last week. It's taken me a while to get around to, but yeah, broadly, I have adopted the suggestions that you've made with some subtle changes. I've commented on what those are to make it clearer. But yeah, essentially, we've defined now the terms set map list. There is one question that I have coming out of this, which if we actually look at the underlying spec text that we had before, we said, for example, GraphQL objects represent a list of named fields. We say a GraphQL input object defines a set of input fields. And where we've defined what a set is where it's unique. And that is true for objects as well. So objects is really a set, but actually it's really a map, isn't it? It's a map from like the key name, which is unique, to what defines it. So my question really is, I mean, I think that this change is good as it is and is probably worth merging. But as a longer discussion, maybe we should consider some of these things, arguments, fields, input fields, being defined instead as maps. And I think that's actually a bit of a larger change in the wording because you have to change how you express it. But I think it might be in the right direction, perhaps.
It's more correct because like what is unique here? Is the full field definition unique? But actually it's the name
It's
that
the field
can only
name.
be one there. Yeah.
This is an interesting question. Okay, first, just like as a matter of like how to roll these things out, I agree that having one RFC change that exclusively just defines the terms and appropriately links them, and then having follow-up ones that then like change around those terms is just like a good cleanliness thing. But on this question specifically, okay, here's maybe an interesting principle to think about that might help clarify. If you need a validation rule in order to produce the constraint, then it's not actually a characteristic of the data structure itself. So in other words, if we had a set and then we had a validation rule that existed that says all elements of that set must be unique, that validation rule is definitionally useless because the set is already defined to be unique. So what would that validation rule even do? But there are certainly cases where we have validation rules that are doing real work that catch real cases where we say, you know, you can't list this thing twice, or these things must be unique, which I think implies that when we say it is a list, it is in fact true that it is a list, and it is a list that then later we want to make sure that we validate to be a list of unique items, as opposed to it being an ordered list or an ordered map, which I think is a consequence of the way in which we set it up. Is that a useful way to think about this?
So you
It's
would
an
rather
interesting
say
way. Sorry, Michael,
the-
you carry on.
Oh, so you would rather say the object field is an ordered list where the field name is unique?
Yeah. Okay, so I think part of the reason why this is an interesting distinction is there are various places where we produce these lists, maps, and sets. And if you are producing one of these things internally, that is, you're either producing it because it is a part of an internal operation, or you're producing it because part of an internal algorithm, or you're producing it because it's in preparation for like delivering back results from an operation. Then you want to use the most specific data structure. And so there's plenty of places where we say set, ordered set, map, ordered map because we're describing a specific constrained data structure that we want an algorithm to operate on. But in a case where you're bringing data in, the input data either is definitionally constrained because of the way in which it was provided. A good example of which is the list of variables. That's a map. Like it is provided in JSON as a map of variable name to the value of that variable to use at runtime. But anything that gets parsed from a query, or sorry, parsed from the document itself, that gets parsed into an operation, probably is lists, just because of the nature of the way the grammar works. They're lists. Like it is grammatically allowed to say, here's a field with arguments where A is 1, comma, A is 2, comma, A is 3. Now that's invalid from it. Like you can't execute that and have it make sense. It's confusing, but it's still grammatically correct. It will parse. And so either like you need to, where am I going with this? What's the form that allows us, what's the form that allows us to have the most helpful error message? Because if we were to parse that directly as a ordered map, then the ordered map would need to like be aware of like, are you inserting a thing that replaces, or is it an error to insert something in an ordered map that already exists? You know what I mean? Like you need to be able to spit out the error.
I think that in general is true, but in this case, like when we talk about the object type, like as a schema type, then a map is actually what you want, because like you want to have lookup performance, right? It's like the type over time is immutable, and the list, the actual field list is more used as a lookup. Like when we parse this thing and then give semantics to it, you would typically do a lookup.
Yeah. That's fair. Although when it comes to the spec text, I'm not concerned with performance at all, of course, because you could, if someone is not sticking a performant map under the hood, then they're probably doing something wrong, right? Like, yeah, of course. But once it's validated, there's only one argument. Like if you got to do the performant thing. Although sometimes for small lists, they outperform lookup maps, which is funny. But yes, the performance is in the land of the implementation.
Yeah, I was more thinking about like what is the main thing you're doing with this thing, and I think we almost like this was actually called a list, but like the typical use of this is that you like when we think about execution is that you look something up by name in this case. In other cases, yeah.
Conceptually, like an input object is a map from a bunch of keys to a bunch of values. That is what it is. Then you've got syntactically, how do you take what the input is in textual format, in variables, in whatever, and coerce it into that format. But I think that doesn't change the fact that the input object itself is a map. That said, I definitely hear what you're saying when it comes to validation rules, but then I'm like, well, that's interesting, because what you've got there in like GraphQL.js, you can't define it to have a list of fields, because that's not what it is. It is literally a map of fields. So if you do new GraphQL input object, it will accept a map of fields only. If you do it in SDL, however, then of course you can repeat it, but that's not an input object. That is the SDL that describes potentially an input object, and the SDL can be invalid. This doesn't validly represent an input object without it being an input object. So then there's a subtle contextual break between those two things. So yeah.
In the SDL, it's actually a list, and it's also not unique, because you even want to pass this invalid, semantically invalid. It's still syntactically correct, right? So it has different. But I mean, like if I look at this PR, the thing that I 100% agree with is the appendix. Like that could be in my case be merged because it clarifies the data structures. And then we could discuss the other things.
Um, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I think I'm definitely game to talk about messing with when anytime that we say list that we actually had intended to say ordered set or ordered map instead of list. But the one area where I want to be careful is where we're describing a concept in a general sense, where the majority of the time we're talking about that thing, we're talking about it as it like coming in from a parsed SDL or coming in from a parsed query. I think on the specific case of SDL grammar parsing versus type system, then I think that's actually territory where it's quite fair to say within defined type system, you do want to explicitly define things as ordered maps, ordered sets. And then we've dramatically underdefined how a SDL gets parsed and creates a type system. That's fine. I think we got bigger fish to fry. We're working on more important things these days. But if we were to go down that route and write out literal algorithms for how to take SDL text and produce type system from it, then we would probably want to say parses to a list produces the map that then creates this output. I would be maybe more annoyingly pedantic about cases where we're talking less about the type system and more about like query. So you're talking about, fields in a selection set, or arguments in a field, then those are all like, as the vast majority of the time we're talking to those in the context of a query operation or mutation operation coming in during input at runtime as a thing that you're doing to define your type system. And then those all do get parsed as lists where validation rules is like a very expected part of the behavior of the server. But I think that's less likely to be the case where we'd bump into the needs to be a map for performance reasons anyway. Suffice to say, I think we all agree. Benji, I really like this change. I'm gonna tick it from it's still stage 0 right now, which was probably a mistake. We should have stick it at stage 1 earlier. I'm gonna stick it to stage 2 since it's a draft. The one thing I'll ask is to pop out the change that introduces these as formalisms, and then the change that any case where like changing something is a list to something is an ordered set, just like pop those out to a separate change. I think they'll just make it a little easier for us to track history.
Okay, so just to be clear, I'll bring the Appendix A changes and the GraphQL.md changes out in one pull request, and then the Section 3 and Section 4 changes will be a separate pull request.
I think that's right, because then we can, and yeah, so the Section 3 and Section 4 get popped to a separate one. And then you can say, hey, this depends on this RFC landing. This specific change that we're making is, and then like list out the handful of things, why the previous data structure was the wrong one, why the new one is the right one. It'll just allow us to be more specifically clear about the change that's getting made, which will be helpful as people go back and try to like track the history of change.
Section 4 actually could go either way, and I'm thinking maybe it should go in that first pull request. It's just the one that says like we recommend that you maintain ordering. It doesn't change the things, or maybe that wants to be its own additional pull request.
I think that's right. I'd always favor fewer or more, but smaller and more focused RFCs. So introducing the data structures. This one you might even be able to introduce without having to define, because this doesn't actually mention list sets or types, that last Section 4 one. That might be just purely an independent change we could make, I think.
Okay, awesome. All right, I'll raise Section 4 as a pull request on its own, Appendix A and GraphQL as one on its own, and then finally Section 3 as its own pull request that builds on the former one. Perfect.
This one was great. Thanks for dredging it back up and getting it back into healthy state. All right. We got one last item in our agenda list. Extensions to request. Ooh, exciting. Okay, Benji.
Welcome, Stephen.
Hey, Steven.
Hello. Okay, I'm again just catching up on where we got to on this one. We discussed this last month, which, as you mentioned, Lee, you were out for. We have also discussed this a number of times before. One of the longer discussions was in September 2022, whereupon we decided that there was two possible routes that we could go, which I have, hang on, I've linked out to the text. So I'm just going to read that. Seems like you have two options. Either extensions may exist, be aware of it, or improve the section and do a better job of defining the input to an execution. Last month's discussion concluded that actually option B of those, the more work one, is the one that we should do. So I've done the more work. I've actually done it in a relatively straightforward way. I've not defined that a request is a map or anything like that, but I have effectively named each of the things, which we already do anyway, because in the algorithm, the execute request algorithm, it accepts the schema, document, operation name, variable values, and initial value variables. So all I've done is effectively added those as definitions at the beginning of each of the bullet points. I've then snuck in extensions, which is the point of this pull request. I've added a non-normative note about extensions. And then, and I don't know if I should have done this, I've actually added all of those parameters into the execute request call that we reference in the text. Normally, we just refer to an algorithm without bothering to pass its arguments. But since I just defined them, I thought it would be reasonable to add that in as a part of the paragraph. So that's very much an editorial decision for you as well, Lee. Yeah, it's a relatively simple change, I think, overall.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I think this is right. I'm worried that the change is a bit in an uncanny valley because the way that it is currently defined. Like Benji, to your point, we're not currently defining that in order to produce a request, you have to provide this data structure called a map that has these properties in it. Instead, we just say, here are the things that you need, and we just describe them all. And then those happen to be all of the input arguments to the execute request algorithm. Because the problem we're trying to solve is, we know in practice, this does get provided as a map. And we're worried that someone might add additional data in that map that might conflict with something that we want to add in the future. And thus the extensions.
Yeah, it's a little bit more subtle than that, perhaps. Because we've got the request, like we've got the HTTP request level stuff, which obviously doesn't have like schema in it. Then we've got the schema execution stuff, which is what you were just describing. GraphQL.js traditionally accepts both positional and object-based parameters. So you can pass each of the things in turn, or you can pass an object. GraphQL, I want to say 16, did away with that and now only accepts the map. But critically, the inputs in the map, I think, are possibly named different. And it also accepts a whole bunch of extra ones, like, I don't know, default field resolver and a bunch of other stuff. Yeah, so there is other stuff that's going on, and we shouldn't necessarily push those things into extensions. It's more that there are various services that will want to make use of extensions. And rather than having to define that in every single, like GraphQL over HTTP, GraphQL over WebSockets, GraphQL over SSE, GraphQL over whatever, we want to have a central place to refer to it. And also to say, it is a map. It is a map. Like, don't care what's in it, but it is a map. That's how much we know about it. So yeah, but I definitely get what you're saying. I don't think that a request itself is a map. It is really just that list of things. Whether that's exposed as a map or whether that's exposed as a list, I don't think matters too much. So I haven't even really said that they are explicitly named those things. I've just given them names, but haven't required that those are their names, if you see what I mean. It's a little subtle. It's more
Yeah.
just, here is the thing that we're going to feed into the algorithm in a moment.
I think that's the right scope decision. Like I agree that if we had formally defined the input to execute request as a map with these key names, that would seem a little, that constraint provides no value actually. It's like, why? The very first thing you do is take all the things out of the map and back into variables again. So like, what value was it to require it to be in a map in the first place? And so leaving it just as, here are the things that you need in order to execute a request. They go into this algorithm, but like, you can kind of read this section as like the type definition or the doc text that sits above the execute request function, you know, here. But it is still a little uncanny valley in the sense that extensions here gets defined and defined as a map, which I agree is actually the value that's getting added. But defined it's like neither relative to where it comes from or relative to where it goes. You know what I mean? Like that's why it's uncanny valley. Extensions in the response form is a lot less uncanny valley because it doesn't say where it comes from. It's like anything, whatever you want to put here, you can put here, but it does say where it goes. It's like there's a map that's called the response body, and there's even some non-normative note that says, by the way, if this gets serialized as JSON, here's the rules for how to do that. So it's like literally describing it as you will have a entry into the JSON payload called extensions. Here's how it works. But this one is left like 1 degree of freedom, more added. I wonder if the simplest way to fix that is just to like elaborate a little bit more in your non-normative note. It probably is not the only place that we make subtle references to HTTP in the spec. The goal here not being to say this is the HTTP definition, but to say, hey, it's common that you would pass these elements in as a map, whether that's JSON through HTTP or some other mechanism. And in that case, the intent of this extensions field is to ensure that you don't overlap with future values that may get added. To make it a little bit more clear, like, why is it that we've added this optional thing? Because I think otherwise you might read through this and be like, I don't know what this is. And then would kind of fail to, it's just, it's certainly slightly more annoying in your code to write this up or code to consume it, to have to go through an extensions path as opposed to just sticking it in at the top. And so I think we probably want to be quite clear about the reason behind its addition.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I was trying to think of another like parallel that we have in the spec, and like another one might be, for example, directives on schema elements. We don't say what they do or anything. It's just like, here's a thing, do what you will with it. And extensions is kind of similar, I think. Stephen.
If we did want to add this for the request, is there like a different section or even a section that doesn't exist yet that we should add that is that isn't confused with like, here, these are the inputs to execution? It includes the schema. It includes, lots of things that aren't coming from the client. And on the response, as you just mentioned, Lee, we do kind of, we talk a little bit about the server to client protocol. And so should we do that explicitly instead of just kind of a note on the execution inputs? So it's not confused that like you might be sending the schema as part of the request from the client, for example.
That's a good question. I think that kind of is the intent of this current section, but you're making a good point that maybe it could be more clear. I'm not sure.
So there's kind of
I'm trying to look also.
There's a de facto shape of the JSON that comes from clients today. There's a field called query. There's a field called operation name, and but that's not it's not the same as the fields that we list here.
Yeah, that's true.
In an effort to narrow down the pull request, much as the previous discussion, what would you think of a pull request that reformats the text in this way, strips out the extensions bit, just so that we name each of the parameters and feed them in the algorithm using those names, and then have a separate pull request that just talks about adding extensions?
If you want to do that, I think that would of course be totally fine. I'm less concerned. Like this does feel like in defining this, it also is helpful to like do a little bit of a cleanup pass. Like I think the way that you've redefined these bullet points is going to be visually much easier to read. Big win. Before it was just sort of prose describing the things that you needed, and now it's kind of literally a step-by-step. Here are all of the arguments to execute request. And because that's exactly the same in data. And so you're just now formatting in a way that's a lot easier to read. So I think that's exactly the right thing to do. If you want to pull that out to a separate PR, we'll just call it editorial and just merge it. I think this is just a great change. My actual thought on because I was trying to look into in response, how much detail do we go into about extensions? And the answer is not that much, but it's not a non-normative note, it's normative. And I actually think maybe you do want to say something normative here, because you're saying like actually the really important part is if you do provide something called extensions, it's got to be a map. And while it's true that we don't say where it comes from or where it goes here, introducing just the idea that, hey, there's actually two new real normative rules that we're introducing. One rule is there's no other data that you can provide to execute request. This is the exclusive set of things that are provided as information. And we do the same with response, right? Like responses should not have additional fields in that response map. So we can say something, we can allow it to be a little bit fuzzy. And rather than defining it in explicit terms about it being a map or where it comes from, we can say, because we're trying to make sure that whatever the source or wherever this input is coming from is clear, or is what's the right word? Future-proof, maybe? I'm not sure what to think about it. It seems to it would make sense to me that we'd have a normative rule that adds that restriction. And then extensions is sort of the natural escape hatch from that. If we say like, well, you're not allowed to provide anything that aren't these things, then what? Extensions, and extensions, if provided, must be a map, which is the exact same framing that we use for the response side.
In GraphQL currently, we already have a number of things that we accept. For example, this has initial value, which in GraphQL.js would be root value, but we also have context, right? Which is a separate thing that we feed in to execute. Similarly, we've got all the bunch of different resolvers and stuff like that. So I think specifying that we can't pass other things in would be kind of wrong. The extensions, I guess the important part of that is it's from the client. So a client can't pass anything else in. So maybe careful wording around that, factoring in what you said before might be.
Yeah.
Do we use the word client? I know we use service.
Yeah, I might make a case that resolvers and I don't remember how we would frame context. That's a good case. That's kind of related to the idea of an initial value. Resolvers are well defined by the spec, but they're a property of the schema. Which is of course not how people actually build the schema often. They usually define the schema abstractly and then provide resolvers alongside of it, especially for root resolvers, which I would maybe frame as like that is an implementation detail of how we provide the concept of a schema. But you're right. Like I can see why someone would then appropriately pedantically read our spec, which is how we intend it to be read pedantically, and then say, the reference implementation is doing the wrong thing by allowing these other properties in. So that's a good call. But do you see what I'm trying to frame on the uncanny valley bit on the response map? Like I want you to be able to give it the appropriate teeth that you want it to have.
Yeah.
Where if you want it to be a map, then like I don't want that to be a non-normative thing. That should be normative. But then like normative relative to what? Like what is the thing that we were talking about that is being constrained? And I think your frame here is the right one, which is it is actually the stuff that we expect the client to provide. And maybe that's then related to what Stephen was saying, that like we actually don't define, which I think is probably okay that we don't define it, but we might want to add in just like prose that describes like in practice that gets provided probably over HTTP, but it could be other things. And what's another way to say this? The thing that we should say explicitly in this change is we don't want you to add something at that, not covered in this spec, but we don't want you to add something there that might get clobbered by us in the future. Right, that's the real value of extensions. We should like find some way in the prose to explicitly say that piece. That's the why behind this change.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Final question on that then. On line 18 in the pull request currently, I've defined extensions, a map reserved for implementers to extend the protocol however they see fit. Is the fact that I've said a map there sufficient, or do I need a separate paragraph that says if extensions is provided, then it must be a map?
I would suggest yes, that if extensions is provided, it must be a map. Another way to say that is right now you have this one paragraph that's a non-normative note. My suggestion is to replace that non-normative note with normative text that can be somewhat fuzzy in what it is normatively saying. Like it is normative to say that this information comes from somewhere, but we don't require exactly where it comes from. It can come from HTTP, query body, post body. It can come from the request headers of various protocols. We don't care as long as it shows up, but it does show up from somewhere. That's normative. And in that case, what we don't want you to do is add additional properties to that thing that might collide with something we add in the future. Instead, we suggest that you use extensions, which, if you use, must be a map. And then that gives you the way to give it teeth, because now you've used the must normative frame. And then that should say basically the exact same thing that your non-normative note is saying now, but it kicks it out of the non-normative note status, so that when you say, like it does say the only requirement is that if present, it is a map. Great, that's exactly the thing that we want it to be. But then it doesn't need to be in a non-normative note. It can be normative in that case, because we're saying that's the must.
Okay, that makes sense. I think I'm definitely going to pull out the rest of these changes in a separate pull request, because it sounds like there might be another couple of cycles on this.
Cool.
Yeah,
and
brilliant.
I like the styling change on the rest of this. I think it's gonna make it a lot more clear. Especially the reference to the execute request algorithm. That's very helpful.
Okay,
Makes
good.
it much more obvious of what you're doing is like defining the variables that get provided to that algorithm. That's really nice. Let's see. I think that is the last thing in our list of agenda. Anyone else have anything they wanted to dig into? Otherwise,
A
we can
couple of
start to wrap stuff up.
announcements. GraphQL Conf is coming to town. Hooray!
Yeah.
So CFP is open. Please raise your CFPs. Let's hear your talks. We'd love to see you there and all the wonderful GraphQL stuff you want to talk about. Also share that on all your social medias as well, because we want lots of other people there too. We have also, I mean, I'll hand over to Michael for a moment, but I wanted to say Michael and team have been making huge progress on the composite schemas working group as well. So just wanted to bring that back. Michael, can you just give like a very brief summary of what the latest stuff is that we've advanced on?
Yeah, so we talked about a lot of batching stuff in the past that we agreed now in the group on the general shape and form how we want to have that, but we push it off into Benji essentially in the GraphQL over HTTP working group, so another bunch of people can have a look at it. At the moment, we started working on refining the directives. So we looked essentially first at how does Fusion see things, how does Apollo things, and how do we want to have, how do we want the distilled specification to look like, kind of with a couple of schema experiments. And now we are working on really giving the directives that we will use a refined shape. That will take a couple of weeks, and we basically will open a couple of pull requests with specification text on each of these use cases and give people time to chime in. So also, Stephen, I know you do a lot of federation stuff. Would also be good if Netflix chimes in when we have the PRs up. Yeah, that's a bit from the composite schema spec. So we make good progress. It's a very good group now, and we have a lot of also in between discussions with each other. So it's a really good step forward.
Really
I host the monthly primary meeting for them, and I'm always impressed by how much they've got done in the month before that. Is always very impressive. So yeah, excellent work, Michael and team. The other thing I wanted to mention is, as always, but we don't say this enough, the GraphQL website is always looking for content, in particular blog posts as well, also technical content. So if anyone is interested in doing anything along those lines, please do talk to me, and I'll see if we can, get the ball rolling on that. Also partially related, we do have the GraphQL grant program. So if you need a bit of funding to help you finish something off, to help you write a blog post or some technical content for the website or whatever, something related to the GraphQL Foundation projects, again, you can apply directly, which you're more than welcome to do. If you want to ask me whether it's something reasonable or whatever, or get some guidance, please reach out to me as well, or Jory at Linux Foundation. Yeah, lots of stuff.
Awesome.
excellent list of updates. That all goes for your teams as well, actually. If you wouldn't mind going back to your respective groups, Stephen and Jeff, I'm especially looking to you both, and signal boosting all of those messages. In particular, if anyone is interested in GraphQL and wants to talk about it, come submit a CFP to the conference. If you want to write about it, come talk to us, and forward them on to Benji to get some content written up on our technical pages and blog, or to be considered for a grant too for doing work.
I should also mention that the incremental delivery working group has also been doing some excellent work. I believe Yakov has written his latest implementation of the spec changes and the associated GraphQL JS changes as well. So I believe that that is, am I right in thinking, Rob, that that's something that people can actually try out now?
We're getting there. Yeah. I mean, basically like a quick update is that we were going down this path of defer, basically like forking your execution. The problems with that were raised were how fields that are in defer and outside of defer get executed multiple times, potential for denial of service attacks, stuff like that. So we spent most of last year coming up with what that looks like without those issues. And I think we got to a good place with that. We went through tons of examples. I think we all like have like a good understanding of what we want the inputs and outputs to look like for all different scenarios. Now we're in the state of coming up with exactly how we want to implement it, how we want to spec it. Yakov has been doing a lot of really good work on that. Benji's been helping out. So I think once we're all happy with that, then we're going to get a implementation we're happy with in GraphQL JS, and then we'll start presenting at these meetings our version of the spec and start looking for feedback there.
But you still think it's a couple of you need a couple more iterations before it's worth starting implementing again? Prototyping.
We're kind of doing the spec and the implementation at the same time. I don't think that we're fully there with either one yet, but
Okay.
getting closer. But still some work to do.
I think the
Awesome.
interesting thing is the transfer like format, the syntax of what gets sent between client and server is broadly settled. It's more
Yeah.
the algorithms that enable it that are under discussion.
Exactly.
Did it change from the so did we change the format, the output format?
Not
In
since
between, like-
not
Okay.
since the middle to end of last year, I think.
Okay, it was more like the initial version we where we forked the execution to now where we deduplicate. That is,
Right.
there's a change, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's a challenging change because it effectively makes it it's more explicit about the formats than GraphQL generally is. But I think it's necessary because if we try and do it the duplicated way, the potential security ramifications of that, even just in terms of like decoding it into an object in memory, are drastic. You can attack it so easily. So yeah, I think the deduplication is key here, and that is the main change. And now it's just getting the algorithms to follow that.
And so the way that we thought about like the migration path is essentially if you send like if you are expecting the old format to have, then we just don't defer it anymore and send it you in the old format back. So that will work out because the server is allowed to, as the old specification is allowed to just ignore the different streams. And we kind of tagged it with a header. So people send in, okay, we are using, I think, version 2 or something that we send in the header with. So we know this is an old defer request. We just skip then the defers. Because like there's a lot of people that ran, like, and I also know Apollo already implemented it. So that's something we thought a bit about how to get the people that are using different stream today on the preview, how to get them to the next version.
Okay, and I guess the other thing to mention is the nullability working group. We've kind of stalled a little bit. Lee, you and I should probably have a chat at some point about our various proposals because they seem to have almost merged and not quite. But the general consensus, I think, from there is mixed feelings on which one is better, to be fair. But the general consensus is that one of them is a good solution to the underlying problem that we were trying to solve. And actually, this is a better solution perhaps than client-controlled nullability was. So
Yeah.
finding one of them and getting one of them out would be a good thing.
There's also like there's a lot of mixed feelings on the syntax. So actually, the pull request that not the pull request, the outline that Lee did with nice syntax, if we did a new GraphQL kind of thing, that is like many people like that a lot. And on the other syntax, there's a lot of discussions.
Yeah, basically either we opt into it with having a directive, in which case you have to look in two places to know what things do, or you have a syntax that has got a tilde in it, like tilde exclamation point or something like that, which doesn't look beautiful but is otherwise practical.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like, but syntax is something that is like very personal to people.
Yeah, it's really important. It's an interesting one. I actually am one of the people that feels that even if we were to reset GraphQL, like, and just build a new one from scratch, I'm still not 100% sure that the question mark would be the right approach, because I think nullable should be the default. So unadorned should be nullable. And then you should move from there through the tiers. The way that Lee expressed it before there was quite interesting. It's effectively you start at this point and then you can go that way or that way, but not like along a path, which is interesting. It's an alternative way of looking at it.
Yeah. I think the most why people are so torn between the question mark is because, like, in most languages, it is like that. Like in .NET, I thought TypeScript is the same.
Yeah,
and that's why people tend to want to have the question mark, I think.
for sure.
Yeah.
I just want to give voice to what Martin's just written in the chat as well. So people are already experimenting with these to see whether it solves it. And what the working group has basically decided to do is add this at semantically non-null directive, and then apply it to things. And Martin says, we released experimental support for the directive, and the first question is always, when do we get proper syntax?
Yep,
So
all
clearly
the time.
it's something that people like using.
Yep, it's always the same question, like every single time. So there is some expectations there.
Cool. I think that's the main working groups that are meeting at the moment. GraphQL JS working group is meeting as well. No, nothing to report yet in particular.
Okay.
It's fascinating how the work is now distributed.
Yeah. Which I guess is to be expected. I mean, here we are, we're using almost the entirety of our time. It seems like we've kind of like chased two organizational methods in parallel to see which one will work better for us. Like one big primary meeting with an overflow, or a lot of small focus meetings with like a primary that we report back to. And for a while, we were kind of doing a little bit of both. And it seems we've now had sort of multiple months in a row where we've not used the secondary overflow, but have had durable attendance at those more specialized subworking groups, which I think is good because it gives them, there's always like an explicit, if not an agenda, at least a focus, like we know the exact RFC that we're working on in those. So I'm happy to see that model is working well for us. Largely thanks to Benji for keeping them organized, because it's certainly a little bit more overhead. Okay, well, let's wrap it there. Benji, you gave the two of us homework to set a date to go reflect back on where we're at on nullability and see if we can't find a path forward there. And otherwise, I think we've got our marching orders and everything else. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Happy April. We'll talk to you all very soon.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.